continuing with water, or lack thereof.
Yeah, slightly different scale as well.
Yes.
My name is John Berggren. I'm a PhD student here in environmental studies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my dissertation work today. So just a little background of where I kind of situate myself. I got into this really interested in things like equity and sustainability, and how that relates to the decision-making process. So if we have a big river or international river basin, how you actually make decisions to allocate that river, allocate that water within that basin. And then ultimately I'm interested in the implications for adaptive capacity and climate adaptation, some of the stuff I hope to get into today. So this is a great quote that kind of summarizes where I began this journey. This is a book by some Helen Ingram and others in 2008, thinking about equity in water policy. Equity requires fair, open, and transparent decision-making processes in which all individuals and groups affected by water decisions have an opportunity to participate. So that's kind of where I began, and as I get into it, you'll see that this is a lot more complicated and difficult than this one sentence will make it out to be. So my research is on the Colorado River Basin, and I thought I'd just give a quick little background. I know a lot of folks are not from around here, and so it's important to know kind of what this resource is. So it's a really important river and water supply system to the American Southwest. Upwards of 35 to 40 million people rely in part on for their drinking water supply on the Colorado River. Right here in Boulder, about a third of our water supply comes from the Colorado River. So if you're visiting, you're maybe drinking this very important resource while you're here. It's also a very prominent source of water for irrigated agriculture. 4 to 5 million acres, depending on the year, throughout the basin, and outside of the basin are irrigated with Colorado River water. If you eat lettuce anywhere in the United States in the wintertime, there's a good chance it was grown right there with Colorado River water. So it's a very important resource nationally. Also significant hydropower, tons of recreational and amenities, monuments, national parks, 22 federally recognized tribes, and then it's also an incredibly important resource for Mexico. So it's not just the US that relies on this river. So just quickly how we currently manage it, kind of broadly speaking. Back in the early 20th century, we split it in half and said we're gonna give half the water to the states upstream of this line, half the water to the states downstream. We split that at 7.5 million acre feet of water for both the lower states and the upper states. Within the lower states, we split it so California gets 4.4 million acre feet, Arizona gets 2.8 million acre feet, and then Nevada, because when we divvied up Las Vegas didn't really exist, they only get 0.3 million acre feet. And then shortly thereafter, we decided that yes, this river does go to Mexico, let's give them some water. So Mexico gets 1.5 million acre feet. In the upper basin states, they split it on a proportional scheme. So Utah gets 23% of whatever is available, New Mexico 11.25, Wyoming 14, and then here in Colorado, we get the largest share at 51.75%. So this is kind of broadly speaking how the river is currently allocated, and then it's basically adapting to within this framework is what I'll kind of get into today. So we have this really important river system, but there's two vulnerabilities that kind of set up my research and thinking about this research. One of the vulnerabilities is an institutional. I'm sure as most folks know, the Colorado River is over allocated. Based on that scheme I just showed you in the map, 16.5 million acre feet is allocated on paper. Most years we use about 15.3 million acre feet on average, but the average annual supply has been closer to 14 to 15 million acre feet, even lower if you just look at the last decade. And so you see there's a big problem. We have more water use than is actually available on an average annual basis. This imbalance has been coined as the structural deficit because it's built into the system. So what this basically means is Lake Mead is one of the prominent storage reservoirs in the system outside Las Vegas. You get water flowing into Lake Mead at around 9 million acre feet. You get water flowing out of Lake Mead, about 9.6 million acre feet. It's a big, giant reservoir in a hot desert. There's a lot of evaporation. You lose about 600,000 acre feet. And so you have what's known as the structural deficit. So all things being equal, in an average year, you lose 1.2 million acre feet from the system. This is the institutional vulnerability. If you've been to a Colorado River talk before, there's a good chance you've seen this. This is probably the most widely used figure in Colorado River presentations, but it does a good job of showing the problem. We have going back to the early 20th century, projected forward to 2060. Red is use, blue is supply, and you can see they met right around the turn of the century, and then the imbalance is expected to grow in the coming decades. It's all fuzzy on the right because we're not exactly sure. So you can see demand is going to go up. The blue fuzziness kind of highlights the second vulnerability, which is climate. Already, average temperatures in the Colorado River Basin have increased by 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit, projected to get upwards of 5 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. And what this does in a snowmelt-driven system, which the Colorado River is you have more rain, less snow, earlier snowmelt, earlier runoff, and you have increased demand mainly through evapotranspiration. All these three things combine to reduce flow. And the climate projections for the Colorado, somewhere between 9 and 20% reduction in average annual flows by mid-century. So you have an already over-allocated system with probably most likely reduction in flow in the coming years. So this leads into my research questions, which I'm just going to skip over because I want to be quick. There's two kind of methods that I used for this particular part of my dissertation. One was just a big lit review looking at equity and sustainability. I was really curious what the academic literature said about those two things and how you would evaluate those two things. And then more recently, I conducted 32 in-depth interviews with some of the key Colorado River managers. Basically, these are the folks who actually run the river, both current and former. So this is federal folks. I talked to Bureau of Reclamation commissioners, deputy secretaries for Interior, state officials, municipalities, some NGOs, tribes, and I talked to folks both here in the US and Mexico, really trying to understand how the river is actually managed. So from that lit review, I found 37 criteria that stood out as important if you're going to think about equity or sustainability. I know you can't really read this, but this just shows all the criteria I found. On the y-axis, we have the number of articles that mention these criteria. So you have things like participation, fairness, like Lisa was talking about. Some of those things are more common. Participation makes sense for sustainability and equity. And then you have some that are less common. But what I want to talk about today was 3 of these criteria really stood out in those interviews I did. They're consistent themes that I heard from most folks that I talked to, and that is participation, transparency, and leadership. These seem like really common themes that I found in my interviews. So from the academic literature, there's tons of reasons why stakeholder participation should be a prominent component of sustainability and equity. The need to represent socially defined goals and values, integrating different types of knowledge bases, handle any power imbalances or power asymmetries. You can allow for social learning, increase decision-making effectiveness. You can better handle uncertainties. These are all the things that, yes, we should involve more people in this process. You'll get these benefits. So in part of my interviews, though, I actually asked people this question. I said, was everyone included in these decision-making processes that should have been? And then the range of answers I got was pretty telling and pretty interesting. So I got things like, yes, I truly believe everyone was included. Absolutely. 90% of who should have been there were there. I've always been impressed by the number of stakeholders involved. Depends on the specific issue. We try to. There's an increasing number involved, but it's not adequate. That's tough to answer. No. No, absolutely not. So a huge range in how folks perceived participation in Colorado River decision making. So same thing with transparency. There's a number of reasons why the literature says we should be more transparent. You create effective partnerships. You increase accountability. You get greater stakeholder buy-in. You support real participation as opposed to what's called weak participation, which is kind of what's known as the invite, inform, ignore. So we'll bring you in, we'll tell you what we're doing, you can give us your thoughts, but then bye. We're not going to actually include your participation. You can increase the legitimacy. Same thing, I asked folks, so are these decision-making processes transparent? What do you think? Yes, quite transparent as they can be. Not perfectly transparent, more today than they were. They could be, if the public wants that. Transparent to folks who have skin in the game. No, but getting better. I don't think so. We've agreed to keep these out of the press. Clearly they're not, and there's no effort to do so. Transparency is not always a good thing. So this leads me to what I'm trying to figure out is the reconciling these two things, right? We should be more participatory, we should be more transparent, but in the real world decision-making context, it's obviously more complicated. So this led me to this question, and I'm writing one of my chapters about this, is there a limit to participation and transparency? Some of the reasons I found for limiting these two things is you can actually, if the public limelight is on you, or if a lot of people aren't in the room, you can propose more risky or new ideas with very little political risk or accountability. One example of how this plays out was in 2008 when John McCain was running for president. He was being interviewed by a reporter down here in Pueblo in Colorado, and John McCain just kind of casually mentioned that maybe we should renegotiate that original scheme that I showed you at the beginning, the law of the river, or the Colorado River Compact. Maybe we should renegotiate it. There was a huge political backlash, and John McCain was forced to walk back those comments that he just kind of casually mentioned to a reporter. And this was in the Denver Post shortly thereafter. Forget about winning our 9 electoral votes next November. We don't vote for water rustlers in the state. We tar and feather them. So in other words, this is because he proposed renegotiating the 22 compact. So it just shows that what he was proposing is kind of what's going on. Like that, people know we need to maybe think about renegotiating. It's over allocated, but the fact that he said that in public was a huge problem. And then this forced Colorado back into their corner. It forced Arizona back into their corner, saying, nope, we have our compact, it's safe, don't even think about renegotiating. So the ability to pose risky or new proposals. Another reason I found was the complexity of the system. This is a giant river basin, lots of uses, lots of different sectors, and only those who are deeply involved can really understand the nuances of particular policies. I think there's validity to this one. It's also a bit of a cop-out, right? Like, if you don't know what we're talking about, then you don't get to be here. But there might be some aspect to that. Another thing that I found was there's this kind of level of informal transparency. So a lot of folks said, well, it's not transparent unless you know the folks in the room and they're your friends. Or, more importantly, if you know what bar or restaurant to go to and where they're hanging out. This is something I found over and over again was this formalizing the informal. A lot of these negotiations and a lot of these discussions happen not in the meeting room, not in the formal boardroom, they happen at the bar, at the restaurant. And that's where a lot of the discussion and agreement really happens. A good example of this, so our treaty with Mexico, how we divvy up the water, any changes to that treaty is known as a minute. And so in 2012, we had a new minute that was kind of a big deal. If anyone saw or heard about the pulse flow of water that went down to the Colorado River Delta, first time in 15 plus years of the river reaching the ocean, that was part of Minute 319. During the negotiations for Minute 319, they were not coming to agreement, things weren't moving along, and someone actually said, let's change the structure of the meeting. So right now, all the decision makers fly in the morning, they meet all day, they fly home that night. And they weren't figuring it out. So they said, let's change it. We'll have an afternoon session, folks have to spend the night, then we'll have a morning session the next day. So it's the same time of meeting, just split over 2 days. And this forced people to go to happy hour, to go to the restaurant, eat dinner, and really kind of get this informal negotiation, informal network stuff going on. Another example is also in these binational negotiations, they were stumbling, they weren't really working. And in 2013, the Bureau of Reclamation brought in members of the International Boundary and Water Commission, which these are the folks who represent each country on these negotiations, and just toured the whole Colorado River Basin. They said, come in, we'll show you what we're talking about, we'll show you Lake Powell, we'll show you the upper basin, the lower basin, really show you what we're talking about. And I found this quote from one of those commissioners that was pretty telling, that he discovered even the mole in Salt Lake City was outstanding. I'm from Salt Lake City, so I know what restaurant he was talking about. If you ever go to Salt Lake City, make sure you eat at the Red Iguana and try the mole. But that kind of informality seemed was really important for them to actually come to an agreement. So you have these reasons why you might want to limit these things. But the other thing I kept finding was there's almost a universal agreement among all the folks I talked to that the process has improved with greater participation, with greater transparency. You have some of the environmental NGOs, you have folks from Mexico more involved in the process, and they said it's a better process now. So again, it's kind of reconciling these two things. And then the last thing that I want to talk about was the importance of individuals and personalities. I found this over and over again that the reason something happened was someone was really passionate and really good at their job and was able to get a specific agreement done. And what I found was individuals were good at not only pushing specific policies, but they're also really good at stopping other things. So one example was, again, with the Minute 319 negotiations, they started at that State Department level, the IBWC. That's where the negotiations were happening. But the Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner at the time, this guy Mike Connor, he knew that that level wasn't going to work. That didn't involve the states, and the states are really like the water rights holders. And so this one individual who knew that pushed the State Department to change and allow the states that had then come to the negotiations. So without Mike Connor, it's unclear if they would have realized the states needed to be involved, and it's unclear if it would have been done. And then another example is about 5 years ago, there was this, they called it a dialogue group, really informal group of all different sorts of stakeholders, municipalities, NGOs, recreation folks, tribal folks, and every few months they would just get together and chat. No decision making, no agreements, no negotiations, just kind of check in and let's see what's going on with these negotiations. 2 specific individuals ended that. They said, we don't like that dialogue group happening, we can't control it, so we're done. And so that dialogue group was shut down. So individuals definitely matter. And then just one thing I found really interesting was through all these interviews, 2 folks kept coming up over and over again as really important for the process. One, I bet a lot of people have heard of, who's heard of Pat Mulroy? She was the head of Las Vegas Water Supply until she retired 3 years ago. But she was this really outspoken leader, self-described as the water witch of the West. And everyone said she was great. She was so important. She could acknowledge the problem. Her institutional memory was great. She could understand hang-ups, how they could be addressed. She was likable, smart, and trusted. Really good at those back-channel kind of informal discussions. And she could help the conversation continue when things got sticky. The second person that kept coming up even more than her was this guy that probably no one's heard of. I had never heard of him until I did these interviews. His name's Bob Snow, which is a perfect name for Colorado River negotiator. He's at the at the Department of the Interior in the Solicitor General's office. Everyone said he is so important. He knows the system so well, all these things. He knows the people. After a meeting happens and he can see certain people aren't agreeing, after the meeting, he'll start calling people and say, what are your hang-ups? How do we fix this? What can we do? And he really brought folks together. He's also known as an honest broker. So one of my conclusions is everyone misses Pat Mulroy and Bob Snow can't retire. So just to wrap up, what does this mean for climate adaptation? It seems like there's a benefit to keeping certain things under the political radar. And clearly there's trade-offs with things like transparency and stakeholder participation. This is what I'm really working on now. I'm trying to help find that balance. And then the importance of leaderships. I'll just finish it by saying one of the folks I talked to in Mexico, who's part of the Mexico delegation, he actually had a name for this. It's called catharsis. That means if you're going to negotiate with someone, you really have to know their side. You have to understand their goals, their values, what they're pushing for, what are their vulnerabilities, and until you know that on a really personal level, you're not going to get things done. So he said he's not surprised some of the things have not gotten done since the new federal administration because we haven't had time for catharsis. And that's it.
We'll postpone questions. Just you want water.
Water, yeah.
So ask a question about water.
All right.
Okay, so I actually spent my summer doing research on a similar question in Mexico.
Oh, cool.
And interviewing Mexican officials. So one thing I heard echoed over and over was technical expertise and the value of having technical expertise on either IBWC and SELA and how that contributed as well. Is that something you heard echoes?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And that was big. The Bureau of Reclamation was big with that. They actually put everyone on the same technical platform. So they got the states basically up and running on terms of their technical models, and then they actually made a proactive effort to get the Mexico delegation using the same models, the same level of technical expertise. So when they're having these really high-level negotiations, they were at least starting from the same technical platform. That was one of the things that was really important. So.
Great. Thank you, John.